What does the Constitution say about the presidency, you ask? Well, let's take a look. So, I've got my pocket copy of the Constitution here, and the presidency is dealt with in Article 2. It says, it begins, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America." So that's his title. "He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the Vice President chosen for the same term, be elected as follows." Okay, and then it gives the procedure for election. Important here. He has a term of 4 years. Members of the House of Representatives serve for 2 years. Members of the Senate serve for 6 years. In the debates in the Constitutional Convention, there were those who thought that the president should serve for life. And that would give greater stability. You wouldn't have elections so often. But that didn't meet the general approval. And so the delegates to the convention split the difference between representatives 2 years and senators 6 years. And so they made it 4 years. Now, as we'll see, at this point, they said no term limits. Notice, there still are no term limits on members of the House of Representatives or senators. You can get elected to the House of Representatives for 25 terms if you can do it. But we do now have term limits on presidents. We'll get to that later. And she'll serve the same term with the Vice President. Now, the next long section of Article 2 deals with how the president was originally elected. Part of it still obtains. "Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to each state." In a separate video, I talked about the Electoral College, and so I'll say no more about this for now. And I'll just go on to say that the original provision for choosing the electors and how the electors would choose the president, that has been changed. It's been changed by Constitution and over time. And more on this. But now, who can be president? This is the next important thing that is still with us. "No person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of president." Nobody except a natural-born citizen. What exactly does that mean? Well, it's usually taken to mean somebody who is a citizen of the United States from the moment of that person's birth, as opposed to a naturalized citizen, someone who immigrated to the United States and then became a citizen after that. Does this mean that that person had to be born within the boundaries of the United States? Quite possibly not. So if your parents are traveling briefly abroad when you are born, then you are a natural-born citizen. You're a citizen of the United States from your birth and presumably a natural-born citizen. If your parents are serving in the military, for example, and you're born on a U.S. military base in another country, then you are a natural-born citizen. The reason they had to include "or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution," well, the reason for that, of course, is that there wasn't a United States before 1776. And so, unless you were younger than 12 years old, you couldn't have been a natural-born citizen at the time of the adoption of this Constitution, because there was no United States. Anyway, no person shall be eligible to the office of the president who shall not have attained 35 years of age. Okay, so you have to be 35. And have been 14 years a resident within the United States. So if you were a natural-born citizen and then you lived most of your life outside the country, you couldn't come back in and then be elected president 2 years later after arriving. You have to have been a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. Okay. Then there's a section on what happens if a president dies. This has been modified somewhat, but basically it says, well, originally it said that the powers and duties of the office shall devolve on the vice president. It doesn't explicitly say here that the vice president shall become the president. And there was some question about this when the first president to die in office, William Henry Harrison, did. Was his vice president, John Tyler, simply the acting president or the real president? Turned out that there's really no difference between the two. If you have the powers of president, if you act as president, you are president. Anyway, more on that later. Okay, now what shall the president do? The president, well, on entering the office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. If you happen to be a Quaker, for example, and you don't swear, you just affirm. Here's what you say. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This is what every president swears to do. Not every president is called on explicitly to explain what that means, but some presidents have. When Abraham Lincoln sent the Army of the United States to resist Southern secession, he did so on the basis of his having sworn to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, by which he meant in all of the states, not simply in the states that haven't seceded. Okay, Section 2. Section 1 is about how you become president. Section 2 is what the president has by way of powers. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. So the first power of the president is that the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now this is important as much for the military as for the president, because it specifies here that the elected president of the United States, a civilian official, shall command the military. The United States was not going to be a country where the generals take over, although interestingly enough, the very first president had been a general, and there would be other generals who would become president. But when they become president, they are civilian officials, they're no longer generals. So the civilian elected officials shall command the military of the United States. Okay, next. The president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments. This is the cabinet, and the president can call on the cabinet to give their opinions of various things that they might, well, on any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So the president is going to have a cabinet, and the cabinet will consist of cabinet secretaries who will give their advice. He shall have the power, the further powers of the president, he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. The pardon power has been a big deal for the president at particular times. In a separate video, I'm going to talk about perhaps the most controversial pardon in American presidential history, and that was the pardon that Gerald Ford gave to Richard Nixon for Nixon's offenses in the Watergate affair. More on that later. Okay, what else can the president do? He shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So the president is the one who negotiates the treaties, and presumably he asks for the advice of the Senate on this, but a treaty doesn't become a treaty, does not bind the United States, until 2/3 of the Senate votes in favor. Okay, he shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, that's no big deal, judges of the Supreme Court. So the United States government the federal government has 3 separate branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. Members of the legislative branch are chosen by the people. Well, members of the House of Representatives were always chosen by the people. Senators were originally chosen by the state legislatures, but that was changed in the early 20th century. So senators are chosen by the people. So Congress, the legislative branch, is chosen in its way. The executive branch, we know how the executive branch is chosen, and it's chosen independently of Congress, and that was the whole point. But the judicial branch is chosen by the executive branch. So the judges are chosen by the president. Now, the Senate has to confirm the judges, but there's a connection here between the judicial branch and the executive branch. So they're not entirely independent by any means. I'm not going to go into the judicial branch, this is a course on the presidency, but why are the judges chosen by the president? Well, the alternative, I suppose, would be that the judges would be elected, but the idea of electing judges, the popularity contest for judges didn't seem like a very good idea. Interestingly, most states, or at least very many states in this country, do elect their judges. And one of the reasons that certain laws regarding, for example, civil rights and voting rights were federalized was precisely to get around the problem of elected judges. If you're an elected judge and you want to get reelected, you have to deliver popular decisions. But sometimes just decisions are unpopular. And so to ask elected judges to deliver unpopular opinions is to ask them to commit political suicide. And that's too much for most people to do. So the president shall choose the federal judges, but the Senate has to concur. What else? Okay. All right. Basically, he's got some other appointments that Congress is willing to make positions for. Okay. He shall from time to time, oh yes, this is what else the president does. He shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union. So this is where the State of the Union address comes from. And I'll give a whole separate video on the State of the Union address, but this is where it comes from. So the president, head of the executive branch, shall report to Congress, the legislative branch, on how things are going. How's the country doing? It's useful to have one person deliver this report. And this is important, he can recommend to their consideration, that is to the members of Congress, such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. So the president can advise Congress on, I think you ought to pass these laws. Congress is by no means bound to follow this, but at least he can make the recommendation. On extraordinary occasions, the president can convene Congress, can call Congress. Congress has its own calendar, but if an emergency comes up, the president can call Congress into session. So presidents do this. Franklin Roosevelt did it during the Great Depression. In fact, one of his first acts as president was to call an emergency session of Congress. Okay. And here's probably the most important, the most sweeping admonition on the president. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The laws be faithfully executed. It is, after all, called the executive branch. So what the president does is to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And if a president doesn't see that the laws are faithfully executed, well, the last section of Article 2, Section 4, explains what happens when the president doesn't do what he's supposed to do. The president and the vice president and all civil officers of the United States. The president shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So if a president commits treason, if a president takes bribes, or if a president commits other, and these are pretty undefined at this point, high crimes and misdemeanors, that president can be impeached, which is the equivalent of indictment. The House of Representatives impeaches a president saying, we think you did it. Then the Senate actually conducts a trial, and the Senate acts as the jury. And if the Senate convicts, then the president is removed from office. There have been 3 impeachments of presidents, against Andrew Johnson, against Bill Clinton, against Donald Trump, but in no case was the president convicted and thereby removed from office. Only one president was forced from office, left office early, and that was Richard Nixon, who resigned ahead of an impeachment trial that was bound to come. So this is what the Constitution says the presidency is all about. Some changes were made over time when things didn't work out exactly as the framers of the Constitution thought they would. The first big change to the presidency comes in Amendment 12, the 12th Amendment, and it's a long, complicated amendment, and it has to do with changing up the Electoral College. The Electoral College survives, but initially the president was chosen by a system in which each elector had 2 votes, and they were both for president. And then the one who got the candidate who got the most votes would be president, and the candidate who got the next most votes would be vice president. And this seemed okay at the time the Constitution was written because nobody was thinking of political parties, these permanent organizations that had opposite views on many issues. But it became apparent that this would be a problem in 1796 when John Adams, who was essentially the leader of the Federalist Party, ran against Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Republican Party. Adams won, Jefferson came in second, which meant that Adams, the Federalist, was president, and his vice president was Thomas Jefferson, leader of the opposite party. They did not collaborate very well as president and vice president. So this was changed so that the electors now choose, they have separate votes for president and vice president. And it goes on and gets sort of more than that, but that's enough for now. The next amendment dealing with the presidency is Amendment 20, which changes the date on which the president, which more precisely specifies the date on which the president's term of office shall begin. In the first 140 years of the presidency, presidents were inaugurated early in March. They were elected. The general election was in November. The electors would get together and cast their votes. That's the official vote for president in December. And then the president would be inaugurated in March. That long time span was in large part to allow the counting of the votes, the travel of people from here to there. It was a time when getting from one place to another was not easy, and it was often slow. But by the 20th century, it seemed that was too long. It became especially too long in the interim between the election of 1932, when Herbert Hoover was basically discredited and cast aside in favor of Franklin Roosevelt. And that long interim period from the early part of November to the early part of March was a time when the economy was in free fall. And Hoover couldn't do anything anymore because he had been rejected, and Roosevelt hadn't taken power yet, so there was nobody at the steering wheel of this economy that seemed to be heading for the cliff. So people realized, wait, this is too long. So they moved the inauguration date from March up to the 20th of January, which is where it has been ever since. So that's Amendment 20. Amendment 22 has to do with how many times the president can be elected. So originally, there was no term limits, no limit to the number of terms a president could serve. But after Franklin Roosevelt got elected 4 times, there was a de facto limit on the number of terms when George Washington retired after 2 terms. And Washington's retirement set the standard for everybody else. Okay, you're not going to be president for more than 2 terms. You must think you're better than George Washington if you did that. So when Washington left office after 2 terms, then everybody followed the lead and said, okay, we're not going to try to get more than 2 terms. Until Franklin Roosevelt during World War II ran for a 3rd term, got elected, and then a 4th term, got elected again. At which point, pretty much everybody agreed 4 terms is too many, especially when Roosevelt died in his 4th term. So 4 terms, no, we're going to go back to the old Washington standard, but we're going to write it into the Constitution. And that writing into the Constitution is the 22nd Amendment. And the 25th Amendment, more serious or in greater detail, explains what happens when a president dies, that is, the vice president actually becomes president, or what happens if a president becomes incapacitated while in office. What happens there? This answered a problem that arose when Woodrow Wilson was president, and he suffered a severe stroke about 18 months from the end of his 2nd term. And he was largely incapacitated while still president. But there was no provision for dealing with that. So he's alive, so he's still the president, but he couldn't really fulfill the responsibilities of the president. It took a while for this to be sorted out and written into the Constitution, but this explains that if a president is incapacitated, then these are the steps that can be taken to remove him from responsibility and hand it to somebody else. And it can be done temporarily. So when Ronald Reagan underwent surgery and was sedated when he was president in the 1980s, the 25th Amendment was invoked. And he temporarily handed authority to the vice president, but then when he came out, he became president fully once again. So there we have it. This is what the Constitution says the presidency is, what the president does. And with the exception of the amendments that I just described, it's more or less as was written. A striking thing about this, though, and this is one of the reasons that the presidency is so interesting to study, is that if you're listening carefully, you'll know that the description of what the president does is really skimpy in the Constitution compared with what it says about what the Congress does. This because the framers of the Constitution intended that Congress would take the initiative in most of the matters of the federal government, and the president would simply be the executor of the will of the wishes of Congress. But presidents took that very lack of specificity and over time ran with it, making the presidency the centerpiece, sort of ground zero of the American federal government. This is something that we see in the 20th century. It wasn't by design, but it was partly an inadvertent consequence of the very skimpiness of the description of what the president did, of what the president was supposed to do. So it gave the holders of the office a lot of room to run. One last thing on this. The framers of the Constitution did not intend that presidents would be as active and as powerful as they became, in part because the framers of the Constitution had no idea that the United States as a whole would become as active and powerful as it became. So the thinness of the description of the presidency afforded greater room for growth for the presidency compared with Congress, which is pretty well spelled out. And so as the country grew, more and more the powers of running the country went to the president as opposed to going to Congress. So there we have it.